Today is if you have not been receiving my incredibly wonderful emails, okay, I have a sign-up sheet out there, so please put your email address on there and then you will be available to get all this wonderful information, particularly about torpedoes. I'm really big on torpedoes. So consequently, that's what the first piece today is about. Hopefully, those of you that do get my email did get the question answered about Dutch comfort women. Indeed, there were Dutch comfort women, and I did find actually a Japanese source that admits to that. So it's a very sad tale. So if you want to review that in email, that's the way to handle it. Or you can put in comfort women in Google, and you'll get scads of information. You can, like Wikipedia has a big section on it. So with that said, let's get started today. I got a lot to cover, and quite honestly, my timekeeper, when I was running this class as an experiment, said I needed to cut a bunch of slides, so I did. So anyway, here we go. All right, hey, we've never seen this slide before, I'm sure. Once again, we are back to the first day of the war, and I'm sure by now you're starting to think, well, is this class ever going to end? Because we never get past the first day of the war. But I guarantee you that next week we will make it at least to January of 1942, so we'll have advanced a few weeks. All right, so the first day of the war again, we're going to take Wake Island, we're going to take Guam, the Japanese, but most important, the reason they attacked us in the first place is they want to capture the Philippine Islands, because this is the direct route from the southern resource area to Japan. So they're very afraid that we will cut this route and they will not be able to get the natural resources that they wanted to get from these areas. So, but of course the other islands that they want to capture are part of that unsinkable aircraft carrier idea, and that's why they want to take Wake and Guam. All right, so let's talk about the Battle of Wake Island. In early 41, the United States begins to fortify Wake Island. Wake Island has been previously used as a base for the Pan Am Clippers. Those of you that are unaware of what a Pan Am Clipper was, it's a seaplane. And so the seaplanes would use this as a base to refuel and prepare to continue on to Asia. And actually there was a small hotel built on the island for the passengers of the Pan Am Clippers. And then the Pan Am Clippers, this is an atoll, so they would land in the secure waters in the middle of the atoll, and it was a safe place for that plane to be refueled and then could go on further across the Pacific. So the U.S. decides what they're going to do with this is they're going to turn this into a way station for resupply of B-17 bombers to the Philippines. And they begin to rebuild the island and to fortify it. So what they do is they bring in this construction battalion. Actually, it's not a battalion, excuse me. It is actually a construction company. So these are all civilians. And they bring in, there's like 1,200 of these guys, and what they're going to do is they're going to fortify the island, they're going to build a land air base, which you can see where it says airstrip, and also they're going to dig a channel through the reef in order to be able to better supply and use this as a little harbor. Not a big harbor, but at least a small harbor, so they can get ships in more easily. Well, it's also going to be defended by the 1st Marine Defense Battalion. The 1st Marine Defense Battalion is 450 men. It's commanded by Major Devereaux. And interestingly, a defense battalion has 6 5-inch guns that were taken from the battleship Texas. As usual, anytime there's cast-off material from the Navy, they give it to the Marines. So that saves a lot of money. They have 12 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, 48 heavy and light machine guns. So you can see, with only 450 guys and all this heavy equipment, all these guns, big guns, that really there's not a lot of infantry power here. There is a lot of people that can fire cannons, but there's not a lot of infantry troops. So it's a kind of a shore battery type of marine defense. All right, so here are the actual defensive positions. We won't go through them in great detail, but you can see that by the time of the Japanese attack, much of Wake Island had in fact been fortified. The fortifications are not complete, but they have done a significant amount of work. And it becomes an air base right before the war. I mean, literally days. They land a Marine unit, a VMF, that's a fighter unit. VF would be a Navy fighter unit. M added to that makes it a Marine fighter unit. And they've dropped off 12 F-4F-3 Wildcats. And this is the reason that the Enterprise is not sunk at Pearl Harbor, because she is dropping planes off to them. There's a big storm. They can't refuel, and consequently the Enterprise is delayed by a day. It's supposed to be back on December 6th, but it is not back until the afternoon of December 7th. By that time, the Japanese have left Pearl Harbor. So because of that, the Enterprise is not destroyed at Pearl Harbor. So, again, remember now, we're on the other side of the date line. So on the morning of December 8th, what happens is they're given radio information that Pearl Harbor is being attacked. So they know that this is going on, and they launch a CAP, Combat Air Patrol, of 4 Wildcats. Unfortunately, they have not had time to install radar. So consequently, the radar, there's no knowledge of the Japanese aircraft coming in, and because there's cloud cover, they don't see it. So the 4 Wildcats completely miss the Japanese bombers. The Japanese bombers come in and launch a very, very accurate strike, destroy 7 of the Wildcats available out of 12 on the ground. 1 is badly damaged, and they kill or wound 34 of the 55 Marine air crew. In other words, people that service the planes, etc. So it's a very effective initial strike by the Japanese. All right. So now Wake is bombarded for the next few days in order to, in quotes, soften up the target. And the Marine fighters do shoot down a couple of bombers, but again, there's so few left. There was only really 4 and 1 that's repaired, so at times there's 5 to defend the island. And the Japanese continue to bomb it and do significant damage. On December 11th, the Japanese invasion fleet arrives off Wake Island. It consists of 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, 2 patrol boats, 2 transports, and 450 Naval Landing Force troops. Now you're thinking, well, if there's 450 defenders and there's 450 guys attacking, that's probably not a very good number for the attackers. Indeed, the Japanese vastly underestimated the strength of this island. So they only had 450 troops that were going to be invading. Well, what happens? Well, the Japanese begin a shore bombardment at 9,000 yards. And 9,000 yards is relatively close for a shore bombardment because these guns on these ships can easily fire 15,000 yards, but they close in at 9,000 yards, and the Marines don't shoot at them. And the Japanese think, well, hey, the air attacks have knocked out all the guns on Wake Island. This is not going to be a problem. And they sail into 4,500 yards. Well, 4,500 yards for naval artillery is point-blank range. And I know that doesn't seem like point-blank range, but it really is. And they open fire on the Japanese ships and sink this destroyer right here, the Hi-8, and damage several other ships. And the Hi-8 is indeed the first major Japanese warship lost in World War II. Well, with all this firepower coming from Wake and the destroyer Hi-8 sinking, the Japanese decide that, whoa, this isn't going well. We better get out of here, and they try to withdraw. Well, what happens is, in the process of withdrawal, 4 of the Wildcats take off and go after these ships, and they're only armed with little 100-pound bombs. But Captain Elrod scores a lucky hit on this Kisaragi, and it blows up. with only a 100-pound bomb. So what has always been said about this is that his bomb hit the depth charge racks on the rear of the ship. Japanese sources have since made it clear that that's really not what happened. What actually did happen is the Kisaragi was acting as a transport, and it had a lot of munitions for the naval landing force on the deck. So his bomb landed amidship, it caused a fire, and that fire then set off all the explosives that they were carrying on deck. So I guess the lesson here is don't carry explosives in such a cavalier manner, because you can come back to bite you, and it did on this ship. So this ship blows up, almost 100% loss of life on it. So it was carrying a lot of munitions. So the Japanese now have suffered a severe defeat. They've lost 2 ships. Other ships are badly damaged. And they have to completely abandon the attempt to take Wake Island. And it leads to the following results. For the first time, the Japanese have lost a major warship. The second result is, for the first time, a Japanese attempt at a landing, attempt to take over one of their goals, has been defeated. And thirdly, this is the only time in World War II where shore batteries actually defeat an invasion. It never happens any other time. So indeed, this is quite a lot of firsts. So now the Japanese have withdrawn, and they ask from Pearl Harbor, well, what do you guys need? You know, what more supplies, etc., we need to help you continue to defend the base, because they know they've been under attack. And what they would do is they would, when you would send a message in code, they would do a thing called padding. You would pad the message with nonsense phrases or whatever, so that when you tried to decode it, it would be more difficult to decode. Well, the story goes that one of these nonsense phrases from Wake Island was the line, "Send us more Japs." Well, this becomes a huge thing in the United States, because first of all, we've actually managed to stop a Japanese attack before nothing else has been going particularly well. And much propaganda is made about the fact that these brave Marines are asking for more Japanese so they can kill them. Well, unfortunately, when the men on Wake Island see this is going on, they basically are very, very unhappy about this, because the last thing they need right now is more Japs. So it's one of those little propaganda things, but it does boost American morale significantly. No. Let's go back. That would have been on December 11th. Okay? So, the Japanese, needless to say, are very, very unhappy about this, and they detach 2 carriers from Kido Butai. Remember, Kido Butai attacked Pearl Harbor. They're on their way back to Japan after the raid at Pearl Harbor, and 2 of the carriers, the Hiryu and Soryu, are detached from Kido Butai and sent to attack Wake Island to aid in the defense or aid in the taking of the island. So these 2 carriers now are not only launching dive bomber attacks, which are vastly more accurate than the level bombers that were coming from the Marshall Islands, and they begin to destroy one by one the 5-inch guns. They destroy every one, because now there's Zeros in the air. So the Wildcats are getting attacked by Japanese Zeros, so all the Wildcats are lost. And the U.S. Navy is sending a rescue force based on 1 carrier and a seaplane tender, the Tangier, is on its way here, but when they find out that Japanese carriers are surrounding Wake Island, they don't know how many, they decide that they're going to withdraw the relief force. So they decide, you know, I'm sorry, we can't risk a carrier. We don't know what they're going up against. And it probably is the right thing to have done, because my suspicion is 1 carrier against 2 would have been a challenge for them to succeed. So anyway, the U.S. Navy is unable to come to the rescue of Wake Island. And on 2:35 a.m. on December 23rd now, the Japanese invasion is reinforced. It's now 1,500 men. And what they do is they take 2 patrol boats that are crammed with troops, and they literally run them up on the shore so the troops can get out of the boats really quickly. And the Marines are fighting back as best they can. Remember, they're very, very light on infantry. They basically have a group of Marines that are designed to fire cannons. And they make the decision that their position is hopeless, which it really is, and they decide to surrender around noon. Famous message is sent out by Commander Cunningham. Cunningham is in control of the entire island. He's the Navy commander of the base. And it's enemy on island, issue in doubt. The sad piece is Captain Henry Elrod, who was the one who dropped the bomb on the Kisaragi. He is fighting as an infantryman and is killed in action fighting the Japanese. And he becomes the first Medal of Honor recipient for the Marine Aviation. So it's kind of a sad ending. Another thing that happens too is many of the civilian workers that were on the island join in fighting with the Marines. Of course, they're untrained and they're doing basically passing ammunition and things like that. They are treated incredibly poorly by the Japanese after they're captured. I believe, don't quote me on the exact number, but later in the war, a U.S. fleet comes by to bombard Wake Island, and the Japanese decide that I think there was like 93 construction workers that were still on the island. The Japanese were using them as slave labor. They think that the U.S. is going to invade the island, and they execute those construction workers. Everyone else has been evacuated back to Japan and to other places in Asia to become basically slave labor. So kind of sad there. And the other thing about Wake Island, briefly, is Wake Island is never recaptured during the war by the United States. We basically bypass the island. It is actually used for target practice, sort of, by U.S. carrier pilots. So when they're going out from Pearl Harbor to be part of the main fleet later in the war, they will often have them fly over Wake Island, drop a few bombs to kind of get them used to being under shell fire under a pretty weak target. And so actually, it's not until the Japanese surrender that Wake Island actually becomes liberated, I guess. No. The only people that were there were people that were on the hotel or the construction workers. It's tiny. It's really not habitable. Okay. Let's talk about WP03, or War Plan Orange. War Plan Orange actually dates back to about 1905, but this version, the third version, is in 1924. And assumes that the war will be just between us and the Japanese. Hence the term orange. The orange plan is Japan. The black plan is Germany. So that's just a color coding that they used. And what they want to do is they want to control the Philippines by holding the port of Manila for 6 months. And you can see in the red circle there, you see Manila, you see the bay there, and the Cavite Naval Yard, that's right there, and then the Bataan Peninsula. So the idea is that they will put a force of troops here in Bataan. They have forts, 4 big forts in the middle of the bay, which we'll talk about more, and they will deny this port to the Japanese. Like I said, it's defended by coastal artillery. The most important of these island bases is Corregidor. They want to hold the Bataan Peninsula for 6 months, and the point is that the U.S. fleet will be gathered from the east coast of the United States and the west coast of the United States to make one large fleet. That fleet will fight its way across the Pacific and eventually relieve Bataan and recapture the Philippines. And then, much like the British plan, as we talked about last week, they will then go on to blockade using the port, much like this. So this Manila basically becomes the United States Singapore. And then they will use that port to station the fleet, and the fleet will then blockade Japan and force the Japanese to surrender. So again, it's not ever planned by the Navy particularly for us ever to actually physically invade the island of Japan. Our plan is always to blockade the islands and then basically starve them out, force them to surrender in that manner. Well, here's a controversial figure, if there ever was one in the war, General Douglas MacArthur. So in 1935, the Philippines are given semi-autonomy by the U.S. government and promised full autonomy in 1946. So MacArthur at this time is basically head of the army, and it's time for him to retire from that position. So there's really no place for him to go in the army without basically taking a demotion. So at that time, most of the time when people had his position and it was time for them to end that position, they would just retire from the military. Well, President Quezon of the Philippines says, you know, we could really use an advisor to help us build our own army, and offers the job to MacArthur as the rank of field marshal, which is pretty darn good. You don't see too many of those. We don't have field marshals in the United States. And he's there to create this new Philippine army. Well, the training doesn't begin to 37, and they're only spending $6 million a year on this army. So needless to say, this army is not progressing very well. Okay, there's not spending enough money on it. They're not really very serious about it. Well, MacArthur makes the case under a rainbow plan. Now you're going, well, what's a rainbow plan? A rainbow plan assumes that we have allies, and it assumes that we are fighting multiple groups of enemies. So that's the rainbow, so it's multicolored. So he says, well, you know what we could do? Instead of using War Plan Orange, I'm going to take the Philippine Army and I'm going to build it up, and we're going to get some more American troops out here, and guess what we're going to do? We're going to beat those Japanese on the beaches. We're going to defend the entire Philippine Islands, and we're not going to, retreat into Bataan and, all this stuff. We're going to just fight them on the beaches. We're going to beat them out straight up. Well, the United States decides that, well, that seems like a pretty good idea. Maybe this will work out. And they completely revise their strategy of what they had planned to do in the Pacific based on this new rainbow plan, of which MacArthur is a major proponent. First thing they do is they make MacArthur the head of this new Far East Command. So he is now back in the U.S. Army as head of the U.S. forces in the Far East. His headquarters, of course, is in the Philippines, in Manila. It's actually in a hotel. It's very famous, actually, in Manila. And the U.S. begins to reinforce the Philippines. Latest fighters, our bombers, our latest bombers, the B-17s, they're all beginning to be sent to Clark Field as a deterrent to Japanese aggression. You may remember from last week how well the deterrent of Japanese aggression of sending 2 British capital ships worked out for the British at Singapore. Well, but the Navy is like, no, don't do this. What are you guys doing? This is not a good plan, okay? We can't guarantee that we can resupply the Philippines in the face of the entire Japanese Navy. What happens really is this becomes a political plan. In other words, it's more politics than military reality. And consequently, we will see this doesn't work out particularly well for anyone. Does work out pretty well for the Japanese, though. All right, so what are we sending them? We're sending them our latest fighter, this guy right here, P-40. This is a P-40B. This is the primary fighter we had in the Philippines at that time. It's got a 1,000 horsepower Allison engine. It has one problem in regard that its supercharger is a single-stage supercharger. So consequently, it's not particularly good fighter plane at high altitude. It has major visibility problems because of the design of the cockpit. It's sturdy. It's pretty fast. It's faster than a Zero. It's faster than Japanese fighters. But unless you use it properly, it's not a particularly good aircraft. You certainly cannot dogfight with a Zero. When you dogfight with a Zero with this plane, you're going to lose. What you need to do with this plane is you need to dive down. It dives really fast, okay? And it is sturdy. It has self-sealing fuel tanks and pilot armor and things that you really want to have. But if you dive down on a Zero and then pull out as quick as you can, or the other option is if the Zeros have a better position than you do, then you run like hell. You don't fight them on their terms, because if you do, you will lose. They have 91 of these aircraft in the Philippines in December of '41. All right, the next major aircraft we have sent them, again, this is our latest stuff, we've sent them the B-17D. Now, those of you that are B-17 aficionados may note that this early version of the B-17 is significantly different. This is not a top turret. This is a dome for the navigator to shoot the stars. There is no chin turret. There is no ball turret. There is this bathtub. And most importantly, there is no tail gun. Instead, this plane has this big, what they refer to as a shark fin. This plane is sent to the British to use against the Germans. It has very poor results against German fighters. Obviously, it's not that well defended compared to later versions of this aircraft. They only build 42 of this model. They take 18 of the older C models and modify them to this standard. So you can see there's very few of these were ever made. There is one existing, and it's called the Swoose. And it's at the Dulles Airport facility of the Smithsonian Aviation Museum. It is under reconstruction right now. So actually one of these airplanes still exists. There were only 34 in the Philippines at the beginning of the war. So this was our big deterrent. We were going to deter Japan from starting World War II with 34 bombers. It's certainly relatively ludicrous. Now again, we were sending more in, but certainly not a huge deterrent to them. I'm sorry? How did they get there? Oh, they flew in. Yes, Bill. Sure. That's a D. They didn't really start getting more heavily defended until the E model. But that's a D. Most time you see a B-17, you're looking at a G model. That would be the most common. That was the one most built. But this is a very, very early version of this aircraft. But this was our top strategic bomber. Okay. So we also send 108 light tanks, the M3 Stuart. It was a nice light tank. It's not heavily armored. It only has a light 37mm gun. But it's really reliable. The British, we sent these to the British in the African desert in '42. And the British had a nickname for it. They would call it the Honey. And the reason they called it the Honey, because it was just so much more reliable than their tanks that they really loved it. And the story goes that one of the guys first testing it out, the officer in charge goes, well, what did you think of the tank? And the guy goes, it was a real honey, sir. So that's kind of where that story comes from, of why the British called it a Honey.
Where did you get the name Stuart? What's that named
Jeb Stuart, J.E.B. Stuart, actually not Jeb. So J.E.B. Stuart is what's, and those designations, interestingly, were all British. The United States did not name tanks until after World War II, I think maybe Pershing, but before this, in this era, we did not name tanks after people. They were strictly M3s, M4s. The British had always wanted to put names on things, so they would usually put names of U.S. tanks, of famous U.S. cavalry commanders or whatever. So that's kind of how that worked out. So, no, Custer did not get a tank named after him. Patton did in the after the war. So anyway, they send 108 tanks in. MacArthur, as I mentioned last time or the first lecture, did have access to the Purple Code information and had access to Ultra. So he knows that the wars are coming. And he begins to, start thinking, we're going to have to do something really quick here. Now, keep in mind, though, of the forces he has in the Philippines, the really only good force he has is the 1st Philippine Division, which is a really large organization for a division. It has 31,000 men. And 12,000 of those are the highly trained, highly motivated Philippine scouts. So that's his main strength. He also decides to create 10 PA divisions, Philippine Army, and these people are pretty much untrained. He calls up one regiment of each division in September. He calls up another regiment of each division November 1st. And the 3rd regiment, each division has 3 regiments. The 3rd regiment is not called up until after the war actually starts. Also, there's major training issues because there's multiple languages in the Philippines. But the officer corps for these divisions comes mostly from the Philippine Scouts. And the Philippine Scouts do not necessarily speak the same language as all their troops, because the troops are called up in individual areas. So consequently, there's a lot of cases where the Philippine officers cannot even speak and their troops can comprehend what they're trying to say to them. So the Philippine Army is certainly not ready for prime time, to put it bluntly. And they are really absolutely no match for the highly trained Japanese invaders. All right, so what's the Japanese plan? The Japanese are going to attack in 3 separate areas on the main island of Luzon, and they are also going to send us another force to capture Mindanao. So basically they've got this 3 separate landings up in Luzon area, and then the Mindanao is kind of a subsidiary. Most of our strength and most of the Philippine strength is on Luzon because that's where, of course, Manila is. The Japanese Army force consists of 2 really highly trained divisions, particularly the 16th, that is trained in amphibious landing. They've got extra artillery, extra engineers, extra everything, really, and 90 tanks, I believe they had. Also, they have 200 Japanese Army aircraft. Big distinction. Japanese Army aircraft are totally separate from Japanese Navy aircraft. So they have 200 Army aircraft that are capable of supporting this landing. The Japanese Navy is also going to have a major effect on this because we're going to give them 42 warships, including a small aircraft carrier. But most important, they're going to give them the 11th Koku Kantai, or air fleet. This has 100 bombers and a lot of deadly Zeros. And this is perhaps the most highly trained, best Air Force in Japan. The Zero pilots in here, numerous of their top aces came from this unit. Yes?
The Zero, is this Army and Navy?
Absolutely not. Navy only.
What did the Army fly?
They flew Oscars primarily at this time, which I will talk about in another class. But we're going to talk about the Zero in this class, okay? But yes, this is a highly, highly trained unit. These, again, most of their top Navy aces come from this group. And so Japan's total aviation commitment to this force is 500 aircraft. Now, in regards to the Zero, we're going to just do a tiny little segue here. Please note that there's a significant distance between Formosa and Manila. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of miles here. I think it's like a little over 600 miles. All right? So that's where the Japanese Navy air bases are located, and that is where Manila is located. All right. At 5 a.m. on December 8th, again, it's early morning, MacArthur is aware that Pearl Harbor has been attacked. But he insists that he will not launch any attack against the Japanese until there's an overt attack on the Philippines. And this is a political action as well, because the Philippine government and MacArthur really are kind of putting their head in the sand on this and saying, hey, you know, we cannot attack Japan because basically the Philippines is operating, because it's semi-autonomous, as a separate country. So unless they attack the Philippines, we cannot really do this, all right? Well, it's probably foolish. So what happens is General Brereton, he like begs MacArthur. He goes, please let me bomb Taiwan. We need to attack Taiwan. We need to do this right now, okay? And MacArthur will not even see him. He's basically isolated himself. He doesn't want to talk to Brereton. In the meantime, what's going on is the United States does launch a bunch of fighter planes for combat air patrol. But what's going on with the Japanese? Why are they not attacking by now? Well, what happened is there's a large bank of fog over southern Taiwan. And the Japanese cannot launch their airstrikes. So consequently, they're delayed by hours. So finally, Brereton gets permission from MacArthur to launch a reconnaissance aircraft. He also is given permission to begin arming the B-17s that are available at Clark Airfield. And so they're finally at noon, they're getting this going, they're starting to load up the planes. And by now, though, the P-40s that have been circling around up in the air and combat air patrol, well, they're running out of fuel. So they all decide to land and have some lunch. Hey, we'll take a little lunchtime here, so this will work out well. Well, what happens is while they're eating lunch, those Japanese bombers and Zero fighters that were delayed get to Clark Airfield. And the few fighters that were up in the air fail to intercept the Japanese bombers. Well, what happens? Here is this is the predecessor to the Betty, which we talked about. This is the Nell, which also took part in the destruction of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. Well, at noon, while everybody's eating lunch, Clark Field is hit by 27 Nells, 26 Bettys, and they catch most of the U.S. planes on the ground. Then for 30 minutes, Zeros strafe the field and destroy pretty much all of the aircraft on the ground and most of the aircraft in the air. 54 Bettys also hit a nearby airfield called Iba, and they cause significant destruction there. The Clark Field attack destroys 12 of the 17 bombers on the ground. 3 others are heavily damaged. The 20th PS, that's Pursuit Squadron. At this time, we don't call them fighter squadrons, we call them pursuit squadrons. Manages to get only 4 P-40s up in the air. Most of those are destroyed. The rest are destroyed on the ground. The 3rd Pursuit Squadron is in the process of landing at this time, and they are slaughtered, and the entire squadron is destroyed. So in 45 minutes, half of the American air power in the Philippines is gone. By the night of the December 10th, remember this is December 8th, that's 2.5 days later, there's only 12 operable B-17s, there's only 22 out of 91 P-40s, there's only 8 P-35s, the entire Philippine Air Force, they do have a little Air Force of their own, that's destroyed, and they have to abandon Clark Field as a bomber base. Unlike Pearl Harbor, there is no investigation of why this goes on. Basically, Brereton and MacArthur, they get a pass by the U.S. government and by the U.S. military command, unlike Kimmel and Short at Pearl Harbor. Quite honestly, in a realistic sense, would this small Air Force been able to really do much to destroy Japanese intentions, 34 bombers? No. But the fact of the matter is that these people had warning, they knew what was going on, and they let their entire force be destroyed basically on the ground is, to me, pretty much unacceptable. Well, here we go. Y'all wanted to talk about the Zero, I know. And quite honestly, the Zero, I think, is probably one of, and not just me, I'm sure many people think the Zero is one of the great aircraft of World War II. So we will talk about the Zero after a short break. The Zero, iconic. What makes this plane so great? Well, it's incredibly maneuverable. It can climb incredibly fast at lower altitudes. It can outclimb virtually any plane in the world. Why? Because it's got a big wing, okay? That gets to be a problem at high altitude, but it's not a problem where most combat is taking place at this time. But most single important thing that a Zero can do is it can fly a hell of a long way. It can fly 1,900 miles. It can fight. It has a combat radius of well over 600 miles. In other words, it can go out 600 miles, fight, and fly back 600 miles. For example, a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt only have a combat radius of less than 300 miles. So when we look at the Battle of Britain, when the Germans are going to fly from France, they cannot escort their bombers past London. That's as far as they can go. So consequently, the Zero is the right plane for the Pacific because the distances are so incredibly vast. The Zero is relatively well armed. It has 2 rifle caliber machine guns in the nose, and it has a 20 millimeter cannon in each wing. A 20 millimeter cannon is a large explosive shell. It only carries 60 rounds in each wing for that 20 millimeter cannon, but when a 20 millimeter cannon shell hits a plane, it does some damage, way more than a rifle bullet. Yes?
Before World War II, did all the countries know what all the other countries had plane-wise capabilities?
Pretty much. Pretty much. The report on the Zero was given to the U.S., I believe, as early as late 1939 when it first came out because it's fighting in China. So we are supporting China. So consequently, but basically this stuff gets ignored or it gets, whatever, no big deal. It's the Japanese guys. They're useless. We don't have to worry about them. Yes?
You talked about high altitude. How do you define high altitude?
Oh, the Zero has a maximum ceiling of 32,000 feet, but at 32,000 feet, because of its wing design, it's virtually not maneuverable. And also, it cannot maintain high speeds very well at high altitude either because the air is very thin. So it becomes a less functional aircraft at that kind of altitude.
At what altitude were most of the air battles?
At this time, I would say probably between 5,000 and 10,000 feet. So basically, what you would do if you wanted to, and we'll get to this more in Guadalcanal, but when Wildcats would try to sit above 25,000 feet because the Japanese bombers would come in at 20. So, and as combat goes on, you tend to get lower and lower and lower because you're maneuvering and you're losing forward momentum, so you're continually dropping altitude. So a battle that might start at 10,000 feet, by the time that battle is over, it might be down to 500 feet. That's not uncommon. So anyway, getting a little too over the top of this one. So anyway, this plane is, by many people, is considered to be the reason the Japanese are able to make the conquests they do, because this plane has got such incredible range and is such a really great airplane that even though it's underpowered by our standards, it can gain air superiority. And many times the Allies think that there must be a bunch of aircraft carriers around, because how could these fighter planes be here? Because fighter planes can't fly that far. So it really is the right plane for the Pacific and does a tremendous job early in the war. Also, one other thing real quickly. Notice this cockpit. I talked about the P-40 cockpit. Look at the visibility he has. There is no radar on the planes at this time, you know, like these. So people got to see. The other thing is that I really need to make mention of is there's no in-air refueling. You do not refuel aircraft in midair like they do today. That doesn't exist. Okay? All right, so what about the U.S. Navy's defense of the Philippines? Well, we maintain a very small fleet in Asia. The admiral in charge of that fleet is not just an admiral, but he also has a significant amount of diplomatic activities. So you need a very special admiral, really, to do this. You can't have somebody that's, you know, like a hard charger. You need somebody that is also kind of a politician. So I'm not saying that Hart, who was in charge of the Asiatic fleet at this time, was a bad admiral, but the fact of the matter is that's really not what they're looking for when you get this position. How small is this fleet? Well, excuse me. At the beginning of the war, the fleet was headquartered at Cavite Naval Base in Manila. Again, I told you that is, in effect, the United States version of Singapore. And its fleet was small. It had one heavy cruiser, the Houston, which you may remember from last week was sunk off the island of Java. One light cruiser, 13 destroyers. Most importantly, they had 29 submarines. And these were to actually be the biggest killer of Japanese ships. They wanted a large force of submarines as basically a coastal defense. So they would sink the Japanese invasion force coming in using submarines. That doesn't happen. So on December 10th, remember the war started on December 8th, 54 Bettys attacked the Cavite Naval Yard. The Army Air Force has been destroyed, in effect, and they come in virtually unopposed. The AA, the anti-aircraft guns that we have there, do not have the range to even reach the bombers. So they basically come in and they drop what is perhaps the most devastating single raid in history. Those 54 bombers basically completely destroy the Cavite Naval Yard. They sink the submarine Sea Lion. They damage numerous other ships, and very importantly, they destroy 200 torpedoes that are stored at Cavite, which creates a huge explosion and a huge fire. It also destroys all the torpedoes, pretty much, we had in storage for those 29 submarines. So by knocking out those torpedoes, you've caused a tremendous amount of loss of capability by the U.S. submarine force. Of course, those submarine torpedoes are so bad that half the time they don't work. So it's really not that big of a loss in that regard. But it's still, now there's just a reason why Cavite is indefensible, because the Army Air Force can't protect it. So the entire fleet is evacuated from the Philippines because they cannot get air support. So now we have no naval capability except for very small units like PT boats. All right, so the Japanese begins again on December 8th. They take these islands up here, including Bataan Island. Do not confuse that with the Bataan Peninsula. And this is the first part of the invasion. The U.S. does manage to launch some B-17s against this. They damage a couple of transports. They sink a minesweeper. They damage a Japanese cruiser. But this is the last B-17 attack out of the Philippines, because now all of the B-17s are being transferred, the few that are remaining, are transferred back to Australia. That's not to say that the B-17 will no longer take part in this campaign, because it will, but what they have to do now is they fly from Australia to islands that we hold in southern Philippines, and then from there they refuel, and then they attack the Japanese. So this makes it very awkward to use B-17s at this point. By the end of the first week, the Japanese have complete air superiority over the northern Philippines, and they make several other key landings virtually unopposed. All right, so this brings us to the second major invasion of, remember I said there were three? The second major invasion is actually the biggest one. They have 43,000 troops, 90 tanks, and they're going to land in Lingayen Gulf. But the landing isn't going particularly well for the Japanese. The fleet misses its landing spot by 4 miles. The seas are very rough. Boats are overturning. Things are going very, very poorly. And so the situation is really ripe for what MacArthur wants is this defensive battle. Well, unfortunately, what they have for defenders are 3 Philippine Army divisions that are completely untrained, and the 71st Division, for example, has only been active for 10 days, or 10 weeks, excuse me, and they've only got, remember, the 2 regiments. The 3rd regiment for each of these divisions hasn't even been called up yet. Well, the Japanese feel that they're not getting a lot of resistance and decide not to consolidate the bridgehead, but just to move inland as fast as they possibly can. And they don't meet any serious resistance whatsoever until they run into the Philippine scouts of the 26th Cavalry. The 26th Cavalry, is a small unit. It's not 43,000 guys. And they are basically pushed out of the way after heavy casualties. But they fight very bravely. All right. On the naval side, there's only 2 transports are sunk by U.S. submarines. So the U.S. submarine fleet is non-effective in stopping this major invasion. Only 4 B-17s can make it from Australia to attack this invasion. So again, they do minimal damage. And after the first day, the Japanese have managed to get a landing beach. If you think about this in D-Day terms, with the amount of force that we put into D-Day, they have captured an area 15 miles long by 10 miles deep, and they've already managed to get troops up to meet those guys that landed up in the north previously. So now they've linked up this entire thing. They captured 3 major Philippine towns. So it's going really well. The Philippine Army 71st Division is routed at Sasan. They break, they abandon their equipment, and they run for the hills. And at this point, MacArthur makes the decision that he cannot defend the bay, and he tells General Wainwright, who's in command of the army on Luzon, MacArthur's in charge of all of the Philippines. Wainwright is in charge of the army on Luzon, and he gives him permission to withdraw. So they've given up the Gulf. All right, the third piece of this is down here. You can see where that southern Lamon Bay is. And the Japanese land 7,000 men on that from the 16th Division. And they're going to attack Manila from 2 sides. They're going to come from the north, and they're going to come from the south and take Manila Bay. And General Parker, who's in charge of this, has no artillery, but he scatters his troops all over the place. So what happens is, the famous military axiom attributed, I believe, to Napoleon is, he who defends everything defends nothing. And that's indeed what happens here. The only the Japanese are basically unopposed. They're moving up the coast. They only have roadblocks or bridges that are destroyed. And MacArthur makes the decision, after only a couple of weeks, to completely abandon War Plan Orange. Or, excuse me, to completely abandon the Rainbow Plan and revert to War Plan Orange. So all that had been done, the U.S. policy changed to the Rainbow Plan, where that we would defend the Philippines on the beaches. That goes out the window in only 2 weeks. And again, now what we're going to do is we're going to go to War Plan Orange, which means we're going to retreat to Bataan. All right, so the 26th Cavalry, again, this Philippine scout group is fighting like hell. The 194th Tank Battalion, which is a U.S. force, one of those 108 U.S. tanks, the two pieces of that, one of that half, they're fighting, but they can only hold the Japanese in the road open for 9 days. Well, what else happens? The barges are brought in from Manila to bring in the supplies to make this thing hold out for 6 months, because remember, that was the original War Plan Orange. Well, they only bring in enough food for 40,000 men for 6 months. Unfortunately, there's 70,000 men plus 21,000 civilians, so the civilians are never evacuated the way they should have been. And unfortunately, the Bataan force has to go on half rations immediately. By January 2nd, Manila, which is considered an open city, it is not defended, which to prevent civilian casualties is occupied by the Japanese, and the U.S. and Philippine forces go to the MLR, main line of resistance, at the Abu Kay line. You can see that in red in the middle of the picture there. So the Japanese begin to search the Abu Kay line looking for weak spots, and they're getting pretty overconfident now because this is going so well that they actually withdraw the 48th Division and the 5th Air Group to go and attack Java. You know, hey, we'll move up the plan. And they only give home with a replacement this 65th Brigade. And the 65th Brigade is not frontline troops. These are older reservists and are basically garrison troops. But that's what he's given to attack Bataan. And the Abu Kay line, as you can see in this picture, is actually split in two because it's got a mountain in the middle of it. And the U.S. forces decide that that mountain is impassable and the Japanese can't use that, so they basically don't defend it. Well, the Japanese send a light infantry, I keep talking about Japanese light infantry, they send a light infantry force up into that mountain, and the light infantry force actually gets lost. And it's actually lost for like 3 or 4 days up on this mountain trying to get through to get behind the Abu Kay line. Well, interesting enough, the Philippine Army is now becoming a rather effective force. They're fighting very, very hard against the Japanese, and consequently, the Japanese are really taking a tough time. But what happens is this force, this little light infantry force that's gone through the mountain, finally finds its way into the rear of Wainwright's army. And Wainwright is now threatened with encirclement and has to withdraw. And so what they do is they're now going to go withdraw to this line here, the broken line. That will be their next defensive position. All right, so I constantly am talking about Japanese light infantry. Remember, the Japanese are relatively poor. They can't really afford a Western-style army that relies on a lot of trucks and a lot of artillery. So they have to come up with interesting, different kinds of weapons to make themselves effective. And I think probably one of the more interesting ones is this little knee mortar. Now, why is it called a knee mortar? All right, there's two thoughts on this. One thought is it has a little curved base, you can see that right there, that you would put that on your leg, and fire this mortar from your knee. Well, if you did that, you would break your leg. So you wouldn't do that. The other piece is, that's thought to why this is called a knee mortar, is it hung from a bag on your leg that was by your knee. I don't know which is true, but regardless, don't ever fire this thing off your leg. So, it had two different charges. It could fire a 50 millimeter, and he's holding two of them there, two little 50 millimeter, and because these are rifle stabilized, instead of like our mortars had big sticks and a fin on the back, and you drop them down and they would hit a pin and then they would shoot up. These come out of that little tiny barrel like a rifle shell. It's spinning. So that's how they get their distance. So consequently, they're much smaller and lighter. The other interesting thing this thing can do is it can fire a standard Japanese grenade. What they would do is they'd put a little explosive lift charge on the bottom of a standard grenade, and they would, this thing is fired by a trigger, by the way. It's not, you don't drop it down and it goes off. It doesn't work that way. But you put this thing on the bottom of a grenade and it would throw a regular grenade out. So consequently, you could have a lot more ammunition carried because, one, these little bombs aren't real big. They don't have fins. They don't weigh much. You can, three-man crew can carry a lot of these. And the other thing is everybody in your unit, not just these three guys, are carrying grenades. So you could have, just say you just have everybody, okay, everybody give us a grenade. We need one grenade from everybody. And they would have another bunch of pile of ammunition that they could use. And those little lift charges are much less weight to carry than carrying mortar rounds around. So it's just a tremendous weapon for like light infantry. The thing itself, the whole tube only weighs 10 pounds. So you can carry this thing very easily, and perhaps one of the most useful features of this thing is because it fires a grenade, you don't have to have a clear space necessarily completely clear above you. So when you're in the jungle, which this thing is frequently used in, if I fire a regular mortar round up into a canopy and it hits a branch, guess what? That mortar round blows up in front of my head. Okay? This thing, by throwing up grenades, they would just go through that jungle canopy and then land on the target. So it takes the place of heavy artillery that is hard to move and needs a big logistics train. It takes the place of machine guns. And the reason it does that is if you're attacking a trench line, and there's guys in the trench line hiding behind the thing shooting at you, what you do is you need to put a suppression of fire onto those people so they'll duck their heads and not shoot at you. And that is commonly done with artillery or machine guns, both heavy. This thing can replace that by firing 25 rounds a minute with mortar bombs blowing up all around you while you're in the trench. You're not liable to stick your head up and start shooting at people. So guess what? They can get behind you. They can advance and take your position. So with this little weapon, this little 10-pound weapon is critical to Japanese success, particularly early in the war. Yes? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, I'm sure it did, but, you know, you put a rag on your hand, you know. I'll tell you what, if I can find, I had a tremendous video about explaining how this thing actually works. If I can find it, I will email that to you. It's really, I think it's a pretty amazing little weapon, considering it only weighs 10 pounds. All right, so next piece. We have the battle of the pockets and the points. So what happens is while the U.S. and the Philippine Army is retreating from Abu Qay to the Bagak line, I think that's how you pronounce it, or Ryan Bagak line, which is that line there. The Japanese actually managed to slip some units in behind, but these guys, these Philippine guys now are starting to fight really hard. And they actually surround a bunch of these Japanese that have slipped through and have isolated them. So now the Japanese are basically in a bad position here, and 2,000 of them are behind the lines. And guess what? That pocket is getting smaller and smaller every day. they're trying to eradicate these Japanese that have slipped in behind them. The Japanese 16th Division is basically desperately launching counterattacks to relieve these guys that are trapped. And they can't really, get there easily. It's really a pretty nasty defeat for the Japanese. And the 16th Division finally, after days, manages to rescue 370 of the 2,000. The other guys are gone. So it's a significant defeat for the Japanese. Well, if you look here, I needed to take a little break on this piece, is that you need to see this is the Battle of the Points, and this is Corregidor Island. And you can see Corregidor Island now is in artillery range of this part of the battle. And guess what they're going to shoot at them? They're going to fire these guys. Now that puppy fires a 12-inch shell that weighs just, I think, under 1,000 pounds, a little over 900 pounds. 305, I believe. Yeah, it's 12-inch. It's yeah, no, this is a U.S. gun, so they're in inches, generally. So anyway, the Japanese decide what they're going to do is they're going to land an invasion force on the coast of the Bataan behind this line, the Orion-Bagak line. And what happens then is they run into some PT boats. And the PT boats kind of mess up their plan. They sink a couple of the barges and they scatter them, so they don't land in a compact unit. They land all over the beach, all over that side where I showed you those 3 points on that side there, on that big red circle. So the Japanese are not organized like they should be, and they become contained by this weird scratch force of troops, because all the other troops are up north of that. So they put together this group of Philippine constables and aviation crew people and leftover naval people from Cavett Navy Yard, and they managed to contain this Japanese force, and then these guys are just blowing them up. Unfortunately, they don't have a lot of anti-personnel explosives for these weapons. They primarily, of course, they're meant to fire at ships, so they have a lot of armor-piercing shells. So they don't have an unlimited supply of ammunition that's suitable for this particular purpose. But what they do have, they use to really good effect. And out of that entire Japanese force, only 40 men survive. So basically, they destroy that entire force. The other interesting thing, real brief, is the Japanese report that they are being attacked by U.S. and Philippine suicide squads. And the reason they say that is that the people that are coming after them, they believe that are so noisy and so out of control that they must be suicidal troops designed to make the Japanese fire on them and give up their position. No, it's not that they're suicidal. They just don't know what the hell they're doing. So, hey, I'm in the Navy. Now I'm a soldier, okay? It really confuses the Japanese. But the Japanese, again, have now taken two big defeats here. So what happens? Homa has no choice but to resort to siege warfare. Now remember, these guys on Bataan, they have no way to be reinforced. They have no food to speak of. They have no way to get more ammunition. They have no logistics train. They're cut off. And the Japanese, Homa says, hey, I need more stuff. And the Japanese send in these big, giant 240 millimeter howitzers. They don't have a lot of these, but they send what they had in to help him, and they send in more troops and more air power. And this does not sit well with the Japanese high command whatsoever. But the problem is, after months of continuous combat, the forces on Bataan are getting more and more sick. They are starving. the 26th Cavalry, those Philippine troops that I've mentioned numerous times, are actually forced to kill their horses and eat them. It's gotten to that level. So, unfortunately, on April 3rd, the Japanese launched their final offensive, and the so-called battling bastards of Bataan are forced to surrender on April 9th. So this part of the battle has come to an end. But they fought really, really well. Well, that leads us to the Bataan Death March. The Japanese are not expecting to have 60 to 70,000 men plus 20,000 civilians surrender to them. They have no idea that there's that many people there, and they really are not planned or capable of dealing with this. The Japanese take a very nasty turn with this. They kill 5,000 to 18. What is really going on, I should back this up just a bit, is they've got to move these guys from Bataan out of the way so they can attack Corregidor and the islands' bases. So they don't have transport for them, so they basically expect these people to march out. Well, unfortunately, these people are starving and sick, so they're not really capable of marching miles out of this place. The Japanese get very frustrated with this and begin to kill them and beat them as they move along. So that's really what kind of goes on with the Death March. George Marshall, who is head of the United States Army, says, "These brutal reprisals upon helpless victims evidence the shallow advance from savagery which the Japanese people have made. We serve notice upon the Japanese military and political leaders, as well as the Japanese people, that the future of the Japanese race itself depends entirely and irrevocably upon their capacity to progress beyond their aboriginal barbaric instincts." The U.S. is very, very angry about this. But what also happens is we don't know about it right away. Several people escaped from Japanese captivity, several U.S. soldiers, and are finally rescued by submarine, I believe in late '43. And originally the U.S. government says, please don't tell your story. Do not tell the U.S. press that this occurred, because the U.S. military is afraid that if this gets out too much, that the Japanese will make even more reprisals against U.S. Troops. So consequently, that's why you see this propaganda poster from '44. All right, this is the Battle of Corregidor. Remember I told you there were 4 forts. One of the most interesting to me is Fort Drum. This picture is from 1983. You can see Fort Drum here in this piece, and you can see the battleship New Jersey in the background. Fort Drum used to be an island. They leveled it. They poured a giant amount of concrete on it, 26 to 35 feet thick of steel reinforced concrete, and they mount 2 14-inch battleship-type gun turrets on this thing. So these forts are serious, Corregidor being the biggest one. Corregidor became MacArthur's HQ during the Battle of Bataan, and there's a thing in it called the Malinta Tunnel. The Malinta Tunnel is so big it actually has a 1,000-bed hospital in it. The Japanese begin an aerial bombardment of these places. Remember, the mortar pits, they're not covered, so the aerial bombardment is extremely effective. But they also start now to use those 240-millimeter howitzers, which have a longer range than the U.S. 1890 mortars. And so basically these are behind a hill, so the flat trajectory guns can't shoot at them because flat trajectory guns don't arch shells. So the howitzers are arching shells over the hills. We can't really shoot back at them, and they begin to fire 16,000 shells per day on Bataan and, on Corregidor. And almost all these batteries, particularly this one battery, Gary, are destroyed. The explosion was so large, it took one of those 12-inch mortars and threw it 150 yards out of the pit. So on the night of May 5th, the Japanese invade the island. They suffer heavy losses. They do manage to land 3 tanks, and Wainwright fears a slaughter with a tank coming into Malinta Tunnel, and he surrenders. The Japanese refused to accept that surrender. Unless Wainwright will surrender all the islands of the Philippines. He technically does not have authority to do this, but he does do so. And this enrages MacArthur in Australia. MacArthur is furious that he did this. So, the Battle of the Philippines was a Japanese victory, but it delayed their advance for 105 days. This made it much more effective for us to take over and control more areas of the Pacific, particularly some islands between Australia and the U.S., like New Caledonia, for example, and we could protect Australia much better. The Japanese High Command is so angry with General Homma that he is relieved of command and never leads troops again in battle. But I think perhaps the most important aspect of the Philippines fight is the stout defense provided by the Philippine Army. Initially, they were routed, but they rallied, and they fought very hard. They fought not only with us, but they fought for their own country, which we promised them. And remember, in 1946, they're going to be an independent country. Unlike the behavior of the British and the Dutch troops, or how would I put this, the Indian particularly troops that fought with the British and the Dutch, these people fought hard, and Philippine guerrilla units fight on throughout the entire war. The Japanese never, ever control all the Philippines because Philippine guerrilla units fight until actually the war is completely over in 1945. So, I think that that really shows a huge difference between what we had done in making the Philippines semi-autonomous and then promising them autonomy in relationship to how those people behaved in their own country and defending their own country. Thank you. And if we have any questions, I'll take them now for a minute. Yes, sir.
Can you compare the Japanese Zero to the P-51 Mustang?
Yeah, I can. The P-51 Mustang's a lot better. It's a much later aircraft, particularly when it was given the famous Rolls-Royce Merlin engine created by Packard Company in America. The Packard version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin became the primary engine of the P-51. It then became a great aircraft, and the only aircraft that was capable of having a similar range to a Zero. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
To what extent was MacArthur blamed for losing the Philippines or implementing the rainbow rather than the orange?
Wasn't, because we couldn't afford any more people that would be in trouble. Basically, it was a political decision that MacArthur would be whitewashed of any responsibility. The troops didn't like him. They called him Dugout Doug. But the fact of the matter is the U.S. government made it, that said basically, we've got enough problems. We don't need creating any more problems. Yes, Jim? He was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. That's a pretty big whitewash. And his father had it, too. Okay, thank you all. Hopefully see you next week.